there's going to come a point in the next 5 to 10 years that people aren't going to have a choice but to face these things head on. And I think it's going to be how the masses react in those scenarios that decides, whether we go down the path of ruthless collectivism or whether we go down, and we advance individuality and liberty more. And so I think there's time to tell. And that's where I just try to remain curious more than steadfast in what way I'm thinking, but also what I think is going to happen. And so that's kind of how I deal with all the mayhem, is just trying to just sit back and say, I don't know. You look at all of these moments, these like 5 to 10 year spans where the future of the world was decided in big ways. And it's like, I think we're undoubtedly in one of those moments right now, and possibly the most crazy one ever. And so I try to look at it with a little bit more kind of, just intrigue and curiosity. And
a little bit of awe, like, wow.
And just being like, wow, this shit's really happening.
It's crazy. Everything's nuts.
Why are you here? Are we gonna live life in fear, or are we gonna stand up and make sure we're heard? Are we gonna hide or live life by our word? With integrity we can be all that we can see in our mind's eye until we're finally free. We can become whatever we choose once we know the choice lies within me and you. Now's the time to wake up. No time for playing small. With a painful history and an uncertain future, now is the time to evolve.
Hello, and welcome to the Unapologetically Human podcast with Dan Boyden. It's been a while. The world is absolutely losing its mind, going insane. And I have been dealing with some challenges and doing my best to not lose my mind along with it, as I'm sure many of you can relate to. In today's episode, I bring you a conversation with Liam DeBoer, aka Liam Out Loud on Instagram, where we talk about a lot of the underlying reasons behind this increasing insanity that we see around us. Liam is a political commentator and content creator that I've been following on Instagram for the last few years. And more recently, he actually teamed up with another political commentator, content creator, Jonathan Harvey, and together they are the faces of Blender News, which focuses a lot on what's going on in Canadian politics, but also elsewhere. Obviously, the US, everyone is paying attention to what's going on in the US all the time. Now, I actually recorded this conversation with Liam in June of 2023. So, for those of you who have tuned into the podcast before, you may have heard me talk about some of the reasons that I can tend to take a long turnaround time on getting these posted from recording. But like my friend says, who I was talking about this with today, better late than never, right? So in this episode, we talk about Liam's work championing heroes, roasting villains, and trying to figure out what makes us one or the other. I tell Liam about my political awakening during the 2008-2009 global financial crisis. Liam explains how governments are the real enemy of the average person because they are utterly corrupt and controlled by politicians for the benefit of the rich and powerful, as well as powerful special interest groups, rather than normal people. An example of this, and something that we discuss, is regulatory capture, also known as the revolving door between government and corporations. We talk about how governments and corporations use propaganda to manipulate their populations into believing certain narratives and act in ways that are beneficial to those in power rather than in their own interests. We talk about naive utopian idealism and how the current political left activism in Western nations mirrors the cultural revolution that happened in communist China. We discuss how ideology is like a virus that parasitizes people and how it's actually the ideas that have people rather than the people having the ideas. We talk about how Marxism and communism has shifted its ideology from primarily economic and class issues to critiques around identity politics, which is so prevalent today. We talk about the necessity of unplugging from the news, social media, and being online in order to take care of yourself, and much more. So without further ado, I give you my conversation with Liam DeBoer.
Cool. Yeah. So I know we're, you have a hard out at 1. So
Yes.
yeah. So we can jump right into it. Basically, welcome to the Unapologetically Human podcast, and thank you so much for agreeing to speak with me today. I like to say that this podcast has really been a project for me my whole life is sort of about understanding myself, trying to understand other people and what the fuck is going on in the world, because it's like everything's crazy.
There's
right?
more than enough to focus on with those as the objective.
Yeah. It's very big tent. But I mean, that's the task that we all have, right, as human beings in this life. So yeah, as far as I was saying, to kind of start off, tell me a little bit more about yourself and your background. It is in the realm of sort of like, I thought about it almost like, it's like everyone has kind of like an origin story of some sort. Like what got, tell me and the audience a little bit more about yourself and the work that you're doing with your YouTube channel and on Instagram, and kind of how did you get interested in these topics?
Yeah, the first video I ever did, I kind of just stumbled into this whole thing. It never really was planned out. Going into the pandemic, I was a musician and I was a manager at a brewery. And then when everything hit the fan, kind of both of those avenues were affected by it, being in the restaurant world and the live music. So I just pivoted into, I knew I wanted something creative outside of music. So I wanted to stay have a creative outlet, and also something that was a little bit more easily monetizable than music. So I picked up videography, started shooting. My intention with it was just to do corporate work and become a freelancer and stuff. And so I do actually do that. That is what I do full time. But then just whenever I was sitting around talking with some friends and family and stuff, and I just kind of shared some views about what was going on with the pandemic. And
against
this was
the official narrative.
Yeah, this was very early on when this was like way before vaccines, anything like that. It was back when lockdowns, it was probably like December-ish of 2020, I think. And then, so I just kind of realized how many people weren't kind of taking into that. My whole thing was just like, look, we're supposed to be doing this for health, and everybody, I know a lot of people that are drinking now more than ever, gaining weight, they're miserable, they're stressed. None of these things are helping fight a respiratory virus by any means. Like, how is becoming unhealthy the approach to this thing, and just nobody was talking about that at that time. And so I just kind of out of spur of the moment made a video and posted it on Instagram. Didn't like think I was gonna continue doing it, but it got shared all over the world. I had people from like Europe reaching out to me, kind of talking about the mental health aspect. It kind of got me linked into a few conversations that were really good. And just the first one I ever posted kind of resonated. So then I just continued making them and keep sharing my views on things. And it's kind of morphed. I'm trying to transition it more into, instead of just talking what's going on in the world, kind of talking a little bit more, doing a little bit more like philosophy, psychology breakdown kind of stuff, getting more into the theory behind all of this stuff rather than, just focusing on just reacting to current events and stuff.
Yeah. Well, I think it's a really good sort of like direction for you to go. Like I've been following you for quite a while, and you've only been doing kind of the videography stuff for the last like few years then, eh?
Yeah, I picked it up about probably going on about a year and a half now. Yeah.
Well, I give you a lot of props, man, because your videos are like really, really well produced. You're making really amazing content. Definitely, in any way that I can help, like looking forward to helping spread your work and the things the ideas and the topics that you're covering to more people, and getting that YouTube subscription level up. When I looked at one of your videos recently, and I was like, man, like if you just like kind of keep doing what you're doing and putting out the quality of content that you're putting out, like you're gonna grow. You're gonna like, you should have so many more subscribers for the quality of the content that you're putting out, for sure.
Oh, thank you, brother.
Yeah. So what I guess, like part of what got you interested in the topics that you're covering is just seeing the disconnect and sort of this like cognitive dissonance with the official narratives throughout the pandemic and whatnot. And just that it's almost like it seems so clear if you just question, if you don't just lap up and believe everything the government and the media says, and you just ask simple questions, you can fairly quickly come to the conclusion that most of the things that we have been told, especially over the course of the pandemic, every single thing we were told turned out to be untrue. And it's like, if you just ask simple questions, you can pretty easily come to the conclusion that we're not being told the truth and we're being fed propaganda and whatnot, right? And does it go further back than the pandemic, though, your interest in these topics? Because like you have mentioned, like I listened to your talk with Connor and your talk with Will Roosh.
Nice.
And
great guys.
Yeah, and it seems like it must have like some deeper sort of roots than just these past few years, right?
Yeah, I've always been interested in, politics in general, even back, probably really kicked off around 2015, 2016, like most people kind of. I think Trump just brought the whole world into politics. You had like everything after that became political. Like it's
like hyper political.
As much as people want to say, "Oh, like I'm not political," it's like you have no option these days. Like it's either shut your mouth and you don't have an opinion, because an opinion on anything is inherently political these days. And like you can't even make a comment about, like, say, Lizzo without, if you're in support of everything she does and a huge fan of her, it's like, then you're immediately left wing. If you don't like Lizzo and you hate on her body positivity, then movement and all this, then you're immediately right wing. It's like you literally can't even have basic opinions about that kind of stuff without all of a sudden being like kind of tossed into a box. And so So I mean, I've always been curious in that sense, and then like ever since kind of Trudeau even coming into office as well, that was kind of one of the first wake up calls I had, to the point of like, it wasn't even that I was hating anything he said at that point, but I just remember having a conversation with a few people that were big fans of him, and I was like, yeah, but what has he done? Like, he says all of this stuff, like he says these things and they sound great, sure,
Yeah.
but like, behind the scenes, you just hear terrible headlines about all these failed promises, about all the mishaps, about all the scandals. And so it was kind of just, that was when I started getting really intrigued by it. It was like, okay, well, if what they're saying isn't being done, then what is being done? And then I just started kind of, going down. I was always a big fan of, before about 2020, it was always just, I would just listen to podcasts all the time. Like the Michael Malices of the world, the Jordan Petersons, Rogans, all of this kind of stuff. And big Andrew Schultz guy as well. So like, I would just listen to all these podcasts and kind of stay in tune that way. But then once 2020 picked up, that's when I was like, all right, like I got to figure out what's actually, what I got to make some sense of all this shit, because 2 + 2 isn't equaling 4 right now. So
yeah, it's mind boggling, really. One of the things, like I basically got like my political awakening essentially was when how old are you?
28.
28. Okay, I'm 36.
Okay.
And my political awakening sort of was when the 2008, 2009 financial collapse happened.
Right. Yeah.
I was in college at the time, and that really sort of there was a similar quality to the uniformity of the messaging that I was seeing in the media. Really made me question, like, how is the media everywhere across the whole world essentially screaming that this is an apocalyptic event that's happening?
Yeah.
And also, I just was like, I would have been about 22 or 23 at the time. And I had this question where I was like, how did this happen? Like, isn't it like many people's jobs in governments and different industries or regulators or whatever to make sure specifically that what's currently happening that is, destroying the world and the world economy is collapsing? Like, isn't it like a bunch of people's jobs, specifically to make sure that this doesn't happen? So whose job is that? How did this happen? Where are the failures? Who's responsible? And why is the media everywhere parroting the exact same talking points? And why isn't anybody who's responsible seeming to be getting in any trouble or consequences for this, right? And so there's a lot of parallels to what happened then to what happened, what we saw over the pandemic. And then I'm in Toronto as well, and I had a sense around that time. I ended up dropping out of college. I was in for art and design fundamentals and graphic design, which also gives me insight into sort of the quality of your work. I'm like, great job, great job, man. But I got really interested in sort of political activism and feeling what can I do that I feel like I'm actually doing something about understanding and the problems that are going on and trying to solve them and whatnot, right? And I guess I want to sort of ask about and let you speak about some of your critiques about government more generally, because basically around that time and around the lead up to the 2015 Canadian federal election, when Trudeau initially got elected, I actually volunteered for a little over a year for a nonpartisan. It was a progressive, not attached to any specific political party. There was an organization called Lead Now. Have you ever heard of them?
No. no.
They're Canadian, but they basically like a progressive organization that is for fighting, you know, corruption and inequality and, you know, climate change and environmental disasters. And what I saw essentially, like, in the Harper years, you know, he was in power for almost 10 years. The Conservatives were in power for almost 10 years or so. And there's always all these scandals with government. There's always all these abuses of power. And so I felt like, okay, well, they have, similar to the you know, Trudeau and the Liberals now, have proven themselves to be unworthy or unfit to govern, because there's just constant abuses of power. There's constant corruption. There's clearly like propaganda and lies. There's so many unfulfilled promises and whatnot. And so I actually worked on a campaign as a team lead for a year to make sure that the Conservatives didn't get reelected, because I felt like they were so like blatantly abusing their power and have like sort of a contempt for the rule of law and democracy. But then, of course, the Liberals getting 100% of power with 60% of the vote because of our first past the post voting system was sort of like the second worst thing that could have happened, basically.
Yeah.
Right. It's like if the Conservatives got like a majority, that would have been the worst. But the Liberals getting majority was like the second worst thing.
Yeah.
Like even the Conservatives getting a minority so that they have to work with other parties would have been better.
For sure.
Basically, right? But yeah, so what I'm sort of getting at is just, you know, if you are politically active, it's almost like it doesn't matter what party's in power. There's the same issues are always in play. So maybe you can speak to that and your interest in that. Like, you've made a video about sort of critiquing the government more generally, or probably a few at this point.
Yeah.
But like maybe share some thoughts about kind of what's going on with the dynamic of sort of like the issues more generally with the government, rather than these, you know, everyone seems to be getting caught up no matter what issue in these black and white thinking and this partisan, you know, infighting and fighting the other side, so to speak, when in reality, it's like, well, I think we have to understand as citizens of the country that we're not against the left, we're not against the right, we're not against our fellow citizens, no matter what we disagree on. Like, the real enemy of the people, so to speak, is the government in a sense, because it is essentially corrupt to the very core, and it's controlled by the corporations and the rich for the interests of the powerful and not for the people. So kind of like maybe speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, no, I try not to get caught up in the whole right versus left kind of thing and all that bullshit, because to me, it's just the illusion of choice in a sense. It makes you feel like you have control over the way things go. And the analogy that I normally use is it's as if we're all on this big ship together, and you know, we're deciding whether we want to go left or right around an island. But once we get around that island, we're going to the same destination. It doesn't matter. We're just sitting here and bickering about which route we take to the destination, which in the case of the government and stuff is always just centralized power. It's just more and more power at the government's hands. And I think that is growth of government is bad for so many reasons, because as we can see, the industries that they get involved in, whether it be through heavily taxation, regulation, subsidizing, any of these things, those are the areas in industries in society that end up skyrocketing in inflation and prices, all of this kind of stuff. Even like you can look at education, you know, you can look at, I was just down in the southern states driving through the states, and gas in Texas was like 60 cents a liter compared to what it is here, where it's $1.60 a liter. So it's like over double. That is all just government red tape that's causing it to be that way. Then you've also got as the government grows, which it is at a substantial rate right now, because the Trudeau government in 2021, I believe it was, they were bragging about how many jobs they had created in the economy. And, meanwhile, I was looking around being like, everyone's struggling right now. No one's
These
doing
kind
well.
of stats are so like stupid too, when it's like, we've created all these jobs. It's like, no, this is just like letting
getting hired
jobs
back after
resume after you shut down the fucking economy for 2 years for no reason and took away everyone's freedoms for unjustifiable reasons.
And it was found that over 90%, I believe it was like 91 or 92%, somewhere like in the low 90% range of the jobs that he was sitting there bragging about bringing to the table, they were all public jobs. So meaning they were government jobs, which, you're saying this is like, look at what we're doing so great for the economy. We added all these jobs, but those jobs are dependent on tax funding, which is a leech on the economy, not adding to it. You can't take money out of the economy to pay people to do a job and say, look what we're contributing to the economy. And so, even these incentives, you see all these problems that we put in place for the government to fix, like let's say homelessness or, bringing peace or climate change or any of these kind of things. We look at them to be able to fix those issues when they have the incentive not to, because when they build bureaucracies all around it and put these people into positions to, let's say you hire 100 people to solve homelessness, which it's a lot more than that. The government bureaucracy, that's is a more accurate number. Like, let's say there's 10,000 people across Canada working on the homeless issue.
Making it worse.
you have an incentive not to fix the problem, because if you fix the problem, your funding goes down, which means you lose jobs. So, there was a recent viral clip that just went around of somebody doing a street interview, and the interviewer asks this person what she thinks about homelessness, all this, and, we need to put more and more into it. And then he was like, oh, what do you do? And she's like, actually, I work for the government and on the homeless problem. And he was like, how much do you get paid? And she was like, $350,000 or something like that. It was like, it was like in the multi.
Yeah, it's like, maybe you should put some of your abundant resources into fixing the problem.
Yeah, and you just go, huh? Okay, so people are getting rich off of the homeless, fixing the homelessness, air quotes, right? So that's a big issue. And then the way that I look at the government in general, and I think is probably the most apt way to look at them, is akin to a mafia. And I made this analogy in the video that you were referencing earlier, talking about how essentially the government creates fear and then sells you the solution to that fear at the cost of either literal cost in the form of taxes or cost in the form of liberty, infringements on liberty. And it's like them going in and breaking a window and saying, oh, if you pay us, we make sure that doesn't happen again. And it's the exact same situation. And I think you can get caught up in, like, a lot of people then look at it and go, they'll talk to me and be like, okay, well, so you just think there should be no government that exists? And you're like, I don't know if I would go as far as to that, because I'd rather deal with one mafia than, 20 to 30 different bands of rebels running around.
It's like the single, quote unquote, legal mafia that is our government is better than the infinite amount of illegal mafias.
Exactly.
It's like, I guess, like,
but the way I look at that is like, but that still doesn't mean we shouldn't recognize them for what they are. It doesn't mean that I can't sit here and say this is how they function. How they function is bad. Yes, maybe alternatives are worse, but we need to actually understand who we're negotiating with here, because if you think that their primary function is to help you and to serve you, then you're going to make a lot of bad decisions when it comes to either voting or not protesting or doing all of this kind of stuff. You're going to let a lot of shit fly under the radar if you think they have good intentions.
Yeah. Well, it seems like that's one of the, this is like, an age old, literally, problem of humanity for eons, is that, you know, the rulers, they function and rule in their interest. I'm gonna have to look up, there was a book that I watched, like a video about explaining kind of like what you're talking about, how like governments and sort of power structures more generally, because it's like that's really what a government is. It's like the, you know, functioning apparatus of kind of handling the power structures between the citizenry, between the rich and the poor and whatnot, and how like they use taxation and they, you know, military and the use of force being like there, I can't think of the word right now, but it's like the government has like the monopoly on the use of force, and they use that power to enrich themselves and enrich those who help to keep them in power, basically, right?
For sure.
And
well, it's kind of like a team up. It's kind of, I don't see much difference between the public and private sectors anymore, because you look at it and you go, okay, the private sectors pay an extreme amount of money to get certain politicians into office, who then are expected to return the favor when they're in office. And then even the positions that, you know, let's say there isn't a lot of money that goes from corporations into campaign donations and all of that kind of stuff for them. Even if it's stuff like working at a regulatory agency, you know, there's a great, going back to the banking bit that you were talking about earlier, there's a great scene in The Big Short where they're at that convention, and the girl that works at the SEC and is supposed to regulate the banks and how they operate is at the convention shopping her resume around to all of the banks and the corporations. And it's like, that's exactly how it happens. There was actually recently down in Congress in the States, there's like 2 or 3 months ago, there was a clip going around, and one of the guys was on a meeting that they were about to have with a banker, and was mentioning, he was like, yeah, my daughter's actually going through and trying, she just graduated high school and is going through the process to work with you guys. Like, hopefully you'll take good care of her and all that. And you know what?
It's like,
right,
you're supposed to be regulating.
It's like, let's get this meeting on the road. And you're like, well, you just literally opened this meeting by saying like, we're not enemies here, correct? like that's what you just did. So it's like, it's the whole, it's hard to even differentiate between those two, like whether it be public or private sectors.
Yeah, well, there's so many issues with money in politics and corporations and the interests of the, you know, the richest people getting what they want through regulatory capture and the revolving door between government and industry and stuff like that. So I guess, like that's one thing I think that I think especially over the course of the pandemic, more and more people can see kind of the lies. It seems like, you know, anytime we go through a big crisis, there is this so-called awakening of people's consciousness as to like, things aren't really what they seem or what we've been told. And even just thinking about, you know, history, it's like, if you read about history, if you know anything about the just absolutely insane history of our species and every government that's ever existed and all the just truly horrible things that like corporations have done and just people do for money and for their own interests, you know, for profit above everything else. And just understanding that it's like every citizenry that has ever existed is fed misinformation and disinformation in the form of propaganda by their own governments, by those industries, to manufacture consent and to manipulate the masses of people to believe a narrative, to act in a certain way, essentially. And it's like more and more people are seeing that. But I guess like one of the questions, like, because we can talk about there's all these issues. It's so easy to talk about issues. Like
Yeah.
we could spend the whole call talking about issues, but I guess like it's always harder to find solutions and to focus on solutions, I find. So
well, I always think of anytime I because I try to switch gears. There's the diagnosis and then there's the solution aspect. Yeah. And the aspect, and it's like we can often get caught in the diagnosis phase and then just repeatedly diagnosing things. But one thing I do try to keep in mind is, and this has just completely changed the way that I think after really taking this in, was one of the Thomas Sowell ideas where he says there's no such thing as solutions, there's only trade-offs.
Yeah.
And it's like, so that's where I try to look at now, is going like, all right, where does the teeter totter here with each of these ideas and implementations? Because it's like, I have no interest in turning a blind eye to, say I talk a lot of shit about communism, and then it's like I also have no interest in turning a blind eye to the negative aspects of capitalism. I'm not going to sit here and try to sell it as this one all be end solution to human nature and it's utopia. But yeah, just looking at the trade-offs between the two economic systems, I'm like, okay, like I'm more willing to trade off people being obese and having other people profit off of that and them dying from eating too much than literally fucking millions of people dying from not having access to food. Like, I think one of those things is very evil, and I think both of those things are very evil, but one of them is much less.
Yeah, it's like one is objectively much worse, and that's part of the problem, is that it seems like there's so many people who are so naive and so idealistic in their black and white thinking that we can, because there are all of these very real, very horrible problems with the current system, because there are, it's like, but when you understand that those are actually part of human nature, that have been part of every system humans have ever devised to organize large-scale cooperation and killing each other as little as possible.
Yeah,
that it's like they see the problems, and almost like people can't understand or weigh them against the reality of what else has come before it, or they just don't know. Right? It's like I had mentioned to you, and I've heard you talk about this, like with Connor, you were talking about the book, The Gulag Archipelago.
Yes.
I remember too. You're like, how the fuck do you say that guy's name?
Alexander Solzhenitsyn. I've been saying it, dude. After that podcast, I was like, I gotta be able to fucking say these authors' names. I just started saying them out loud on repeat.
It's so funny because like after I listened to that conversation like a couple weeks ago, and then having the lead up to our call, I've been like doing the same thing. Like I deliver groceries for this organic food company, and I listen to podcasts like all day pretty much. And every time I've been thinking about it, that part of your conversation has been crossing my mind. And I'm like, it's so funny. I'm like driving around. I'm like, Solzhenitsyn. So funny. But yeah, like it's, I started listening to, I've heard it. Obviously, Jordan Peterson talks about it a lot, and I've heard a lot of different people mention Solzhenitsyn and the Gulag Archipelago, talking about, what the fuck happened in the Soviet Union, in their concentration camps, the Gulag system.
Yeah.
And I listened to you guys talked about the book Ordinary Men.
Yeah.
About how regular people did the horrible things that they did in Nazi Germany.
Yeah.
I listened to Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning.
Oh, nice. Dope.
As well.
Great book.
And it's like, I wish people could understand just how truly fucked up humans are, and our history is. And that even though we have these like really, really terrible, somewhat intractable problems with the current system,
Yeah.
it's like the answer isn't to destroy everything and
Yes.
go back to something that we know is objectively horrifically
Yeah.
much more worse, despite the fact that it's like, you know, it's like being able to still acknowledge that the issues with and the corruptions within capitalism, they're horrific as well in a
Yeah.
lot of ways. And I guess, you know, it's like if people could only understand that these are problems of human nature.
Yeah. Oh, for
Right.
sure. And dude, and you know, people will say to me when I talk ill about, say, revolutionaries or activists or people searching for, and don't get me wrong, I think we should 100% be searching to improve, like by all means, all the time.
Yeah.
There's more than enough ways we can. But I'm talking, when I say that kind of stuff, I'm more so talking about these like grandiose solutions, like we're going to end economic inequality throughout,
which is
like
never
that
going to
idea.
happen.
It's like
it's just impossible.
100%. And then, you know, people, so when I talk about that kind of stuff, people are like, oh, it sounds like you just want to keep up the status quo. And you're like, let's actually zoom out for a second here and look at what the status quo of humanity is, because this little blip you're calling the status quo of the last 100 years, like 100 to 150 years, that is not the status quo of humanity. If you look back out, if you look back out over 2,000 years, even further, like, because we're starting to get that kind of information now, but the status quo was slavery, feudalism, like there was
serfdom,
no
everyone, like 95% plus 98% of the human population for almost all of humanity were peasants. They were like, it's like everyone was poor with no rights and no property up until like 10 seconds ago in the grand scheme of things. And it's just this like this gross misunderstanding of the history of our species, both distant and recent, and that like, you know, the problems that we have now are very real and they're very serious, but they pale in comparison to, you know, what happened under communism in multiple countries in the 20th century alone, with the, you know, hundreds of millions of people killed by their governments and by these systems. That is like, I guess like one of the challenges for us, you know, people like us who are interested in and focused on, you know, talking about these issues, it's like the, you know, other side, so to speak. We have to be able to have like a conversation about like, well, the fact that like we're much more similar than we're different. We ultimately want mostly the same things, but we disagree like extremely deeply on how to get there. But just that like so many of the things that people are advocating for, which you talk a lot about in your most recent newsletter, kind of breaking down the similarities between the current like left progressivism, social justice movement with what happened in communist China. Right.
They're very similar. And I've started to look at you know, ideas in general, like ideologies. I'm fascinated with that more than I am politics in general, but obviously ideologies and politics can't really be separated all that much. But so looking at that, to me, it seems there's no difference between ideas and viruses, in the sense that they kind of take on a host. You know, Carl Jung had the famous saying, ideas, or people don't have ideas, ideas have people. And I think that's very true, in the sense where there's these modes of thinking, these kind of mental maps per se that people download and then use those to operate within the world, and that becomes their lens that they look through. It'd be like the difference between looking at, you know, night vision or infrared. It's like it completely colors their vision of what's around them depending on what mental map they download and use. And so I think just like a virus, when it has trouble infecting a host, or a host gets a little bit of immunity towards it, because you look back at, say, something like communism. Communism had a really hard time spreading in the West because capitalism was offering the working class, you know, some a decent lifestyle,
a better life. Yeah,
it was subsistence, and you know, it might not be, you know, pots of gold and rainbow along the way, but it was better than, you know, what was taking place in the countries where communism did take hold, like places like Russia and China, which were very feudal, you know, places. The people there, the working class per se, didn't have good lives at all. So, you know, oh, let's throw our hat into this revolution and hopefully things are better on the other side. And whereas in the West, people didn't really want to risk what they had. They were like, no, I feel pretty happy with what I have. I don't want to, you know, cause a revolution. So I think what ended up happening was this Marxism communism idea ended up shifting just like a normal virus would.
Yeah,
mutated, and it's just taking on these different characteristics. And now, instead of it being the typical working class that it's trying to infect and propagate through, as far as, you know, spreading that idea, it's now doing it through the, you know, postmodernism is the famous French philosophers that kind of birthed postmodernism, like Foucault and Derrida. They even admitted, they were all Marxists, and they even admitted that this was a branch out of Marxism, and it's essentially just Marxism with the lens of, instead of between economic classes, it's identity classes which make up your economic standing. So it's like, so it's just literally morphed into this little different thing now, where now we say, oh, it's your race, your gender, your sexuality, all of this kind of stuff that determines whether you are oppressed or not. And it's the exact same rhetoric as, you know, going back to communist China, or, you know, the Bolsheviks in the Soviet Union. Like, it's all the exact same ideas with just a little, it's literally like you're ad-libbing the Communist Manifesto and stuff around.
It's like, it is really interesting, because it really is this, like, the ideas have us. It's not, because it's like, these ideas have been around forever. These problems have been around forever. These struggles have been around forever. And they've been sort of manifesting through individuals over time. So I think about this in a way similar to like a corporation, right? Like, a corporation isn't a real thing. It's only something that we've created as a mental structure for how to organize individual human beings towards a shared common goal.
Yes.
But that those individual human beings actually are subject to the sort of like the needs and the sort of like the incentives and the thinking of the corporation. Like, it becomes almost like this entity that is metaphysical in a sense.
Yeah, for sure.
Right? Because it's like, it's, you know, we humans, we, you know, we're small little creatures that exist for a really finite amount of time, whereas some of the corporations that are existing today have been around for like a few hundred years for the oldest ones. And so it's like they're gargantuan sort of entities that are made up of a bunch of individuals. They outlive the, you know, lifespan of an individual, and all of the people that are involved in it over time, and they come in and out, they're all working toward, it's almost like the corporation is this like psychic brain that's like controlling all the people in it, like little marionettes. And these ideas that, like, communism versus capitalism versus whatever, all of the struggles that we have is like this sort of metaphysical thing, like the idea, and it's propagating itself. And yeah, now we see that it's like, you know, the same things we've struggled with for so long have morphed, and they've taken on a new sort of face, like a new mask, in the form of a lot of what's going on with identity politics. And it's, I guess, like, I'm curious what your thoughts are, because you're really focused on this. You're really putting out a lot of content on this. And so there's a couple questions that maybe we can sort of like wrap up on these, because we're coming to the end of our time here. One, I wonder, focusing on this stuff, how do you not let it like drive you crazy? Because it can be, I find for myself, a little crazy making, because the more I learn about, you know, human psychology and history, and the really deep sort of complexities and intricacies of like what the fuck is going on, it just seems like this sort of like, just almost like a, you know, we're David versus Goliath type of thing. Like, it's like this gargantuan, you know, intractable set of super complex issues, where the mask that most people seem to have fallen for, which kind of always do, that's why propaganda works, is like it's working, it's doing really well. So it's like, you know, like what you're doing by creating the content that you're creating, what we're doing right now by having conversations like this and sharing it, that's certainly part of the, you know, focusing on solutions. We have to at least outline the problems and fight back against the things that are clearly like wrong and naive utopian thinking and whatnot. But yeah, I guess, yeah, like, how do you sort of stay sane if you're focusing on this stuff as much as you are, and stay well? And yeah, just, I don't know, what are your thoughts about sort of like that seemingly intractable nature of these problems? It's like, I guess one of the things I've thought about in listening to Man's Search for Meaning and the Gulag Archipelago is, when you get, you know, first-hand historical accounts of the depth of the evilness that can overtake people, the human nature, and understanding too, is similar to so many things that happened over the pandemic. It's like, people will do anything to sort of save themselves in the face of fear. It's like the idea that, you know, any one of us, the, you know, the line between good and evil goes through the center of every human heart. If we were in the, you know, environment of Nazi Germany, or the environment of the Soviet Union or communist China, then we easily could have become one of the guards that are perpetrating these just straight up horrific atrocities on other people. And the reason that would be happening is largely because it's like, well, if it's me or you, then sorry, but like, I'll do anything to save myself, and I'll, you know, justify anything I have to do so. So yeah, like, how do you not let that sort of like get to you? Because it's really dark, it's really heavy stuff.
I've got a couple ways. So the stuff that gets to me and like actually does start weighing on my head is the stuff that goes on today. And that's why I've largely checked out of current events, is because I realized that was weighing on me. Like, all right, waking up every morning being like, what's the craziest shit happening in the news today that I'm gonna share my opinion on. And yeah, it's just like, that's fucking too much.
It's not, like, it's traumatizing. It's like,
for the 6 months I was doing that, I gained like 30 pounds. I started drinking like crazy. I stopped working out. Like, it was like, it was kind of one of those moments where like all of a sudden I was like, holy fuck, like this does take a toll on you. It's not easy. And that's when I was like, all right, I'm going to start unplugging from all this stuff. Because even before I started doing all this commentary, I really wasn't plugged in online that hard. And but after putting myself into it, I was just all I was doing all the time. And so I stepped back, and yeah, now I don't really look at social media, all of that kind of stuff. And I just try to focus on working out, being healthy on that front, like not drinking, just keeping general lifestyle very stress low, like and healthy. There's a lot that can feed in on from that side into making these topics and stuff stressful to deal with. And then I do think there is a little bit of a kind of probably personality trait or something, where I remember Orwell once said it in an interview. He said, I think I have a profound ability to face the horrors of humanity face on. And I was like, and I think I have that a little bit, where it's just like, I'm able to look at these kind of extreme tragedies and not get, because I look at them as kind of like a manual as to how to not fall into that trap, because it's so ever present and it is dark. And people, it's somebody that I've heard talk about it quite a bit is Peterson, right? He talks about how that was his whole book around Maps of Meaning, was going down into the darkest alleys of humanity to try to figure out a pathway to not lead down that road.
Like what happened and how do we make sure it doesn't happen anymore?
And how one thing that I've noticed, and I've never heard him say this out loud, but I'm guessing this is probably the connection, is where he, and it is hilarious when he does, I can't help but crack up, but when he like starts crying and tearing up in podcasts or stuff like this a lot, like he gets ripped on online for it all the time. But then I look at it and I go, yeah, but if you understand the darkness that man's gone through and looked in his head and so when he starts crying about hearing somebody achieve great things that was in a bad position or something like that, it's like that's the counterweight to the darkness that he's faced. And that's one of those things where I look at and I think I've started to enjoy those moments, and this is kind of a positive thing to looking at those terrible aspects of humanity, is now in those moments when I'm just having a good time with friends, or having dinner with family, or traveling, or looking at something amazing, like just it puts into perspective how lucky it is to be able to have those moments to enjoy those things. Because like you were saying earlier, like 98% of people throughout humanity not having, like it was just pure suffering. Like there was very little to life other than suffering. And so I think by looking at the suffering, people talk about being grateful and doing their gratitude journals and all this kind of stuff. And it's like, I don't think you can be truly grateful unless you look at what the alternative possibly is.
It's like to have like a real perspective. It's like, are you familiar with Acura the Dawn?
No.
So Acura the Dawn is this producer that he does like cool lo-fi hip hop and like rock instrumentals, and he takes lecture like speech from Peterson and Rogan and Jocko and Goggins and all these people, and uses that as the words to the songs and stuff like that. Yeah, he's really great. Actually, I paid him years ago before he like blew up a bit more. He's gotten quite successful at what he's doing, and he produced my podcast intro music.
Oh, sick.
Yeah. But there's one of the songs is Gary Vaynerchuk talking about how he's like, I'm not naive to the problems that are going on in our society, in our world, but like, get it through your fucking dome that this is the greatest year to ever be alive in the history of mankind.
Yeah.
And he goes into a lot of the reasons why, but he's like, I just wish we had perspective. Like if there was a time machine that you could go back and live one fucking day in like just even like your great grandparents' shoes and see how fucking good we have it, then it's like, that's part of the thing with, I think there is something to our like psychology and temperament for people to focus on these issues without it like destroying them, and to have that sort of like that incentive, or that drive to understand the most horrific things that we're capable of, so that we can understand what happened, try to see it if it's happening again, which it is in a lot of ways, try to avoid it, and then just like having that perspective to then really actually enjoy the, those little moments that you're talking about, and the things that we do have. Because it seems like the likelihood, and I guess so I'll finish up here, I know you got to go, just with like where can people find you, and also just give sort of like closing thoughts on it. It seems like, with some of these crazy atrocities that have happened in history, there probably was always people like us trying to understand what's going on. And it's like, we know that the people in power go after the intellectuals, they go after the dissidents and whatnot. And that it seems, historically speaking, like people haven't been able to sort of actually head off these atrocities, and that we might continue to go down a path into an unstoppable horror to some degree. Beautifully positive note to end on. I guess just like what are, and I'm asking for myself, because I focus on this stuff, and I do have challenges with not letting it get to me too much, and kind of the ebb and flow of like realizing when you need to pull back. I guess just like ending thoughts on where do you think this is all headed in some sense, or what's like is there anything in particular to leave on a positive note, that you're optimistic with the things that to be optimistic about the path that we're on and where we're headed, and then end with where can people find you?
I think actually going to one of Michael Malice's forms of thought here on the whole looking forward to the future kind of thing is he differentiates between being hopeful and being optimistic, and he kind of talks about being optimistic is there's a lot of naivety in it. You're looking at, you're assuming that things will be good is what the optimist does, whereas the hopeful is aware that there is multiple outcomes that could happen, but they are wishing for the best, and they are rooting for the best scenario to happen. And he just recently put out a book where I actually want to dive into it. I haven't read it yet, but I'm aware of the concept.
The White Pill?
The White Pill is what it's called. And the whole concept of the book is essentially he outlines the Soviet Union and the Marxist revolution that went through there. And he details the horrors much that happened in these gulags and these forced labor camps and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And how he says, it's easy to sit there and get wrapped up in all of the horrors that happened in really because there's no shortage of them. There's an endless list. But he's like, but you can also look at the fact that the good guys won at the end of it. The communist regime fell. Like he's like, they didn't win. He's like, they may have reigned for a bit, but they didn't win. And so that's kind of the whole arcing theory of his book, essentially. And so I do look at it that way, and I think we're on a ledge between people look at the world through left versus right, all of this kind of stuff. I tend to look at it as the difference between centralization and decentralization, and I think that's the battle that's happening right now is individuality or group identity, collectivism. And so I haven't seen enough one way or another to either be extremely happy with the direction or be in doom and gloom. I have those days or weeks where I'm in that kind of mode, but I can usually talk myself out of them, as the fact that there is the chance that decentralization and individuality wins and pushes through, and we're kind of at this like point with AI and the internet and all of this kind of stuff where that's going to be the launching zone. And I think, which way does it go? I'm not a big finance guy in this sense, one way or the other, but it's like, does Bitcoin or central bank digital currencies win?
There's so many things,
it's like little things like that. And I go, okay, so it's like, which one of those? And those are all up in the air right now. I think where, I see people talk about stuff like the central bank digital currencies, which is like the ultimate centralization. And anybody that I hear talk about it isn't really on board with it. So I hear very little proponents of these things. So so I have hope for the fact that there's going to come a point in the next 5 to 10 years that people aren't going to have a choice but to face these things head on. And I think it's going to be how the masses react in those scenarios that decides, whether we go down the path of ruthless collectivism or whether we go down, some and we advance individuality and liberty more. And so I think there's time to tell. And that's where I just try to remain curious more than steadfast in what way I'm thinking, but also what I think is going to happen. And so that's kind of how I deal with all the mayhem, is just trying to just sit back and say, I don't know.
Yeah, for sure. It's like that story about the Chinese farmer where no matter what happens, good or bad, people jump to conclusions that, this is good, this is bad. But sort of the wise Chinese farmer father figure is like, I can't call it. And we'll see how it plays out. The opposite happens. So that's a good note to end on. People have, and we have a fabulous track record of our history that once things get bad enough, they get more clear to people what's going on, what's going wrong. And even if it does end up in like a pretty terrible like situation for a period of time, that eventually people deal with it and they sort of like fix it. And there's nothing to suggest really that track record, which is 100%, is going to change basically. It might be a rough period to go through before we get there. But I guess, and like you said, adding AI at the end there, it's like, we're just really along for the ride here, and as things have got more complex, they've gotten crazier and crazier, and we're just going to have to fucking ride the waves. And
I try to think of it like, there's these time periods in history, whether it be the, 1935 to 42 World War II, or whether it be the Great Depression of 1920 20s to 30s, or the American Revolution in the late 1700s. You look at all of these moments, these like 5 to 10 year spans where the future of the world was decided in big ways. And it's like, I think we're undoubtedly in one of those moments right now, and possibly the most crazy one ever. And so I try to look at it with a little bit more kind of just intrigue and curiosity, and
a little bit of awe, like wow,
just being like wow, this shit's really happening.
It's crazy. Everything's nuts.
And then just like, because you look back and you go like, oh, I wonder what it would have been like to live in that time. Like what were everybody's feelings like going out, walking around, like seeing what it's like, and then what was the general consensus. And it's like, well, we're just in one of those times right now, if you look at it that way.
And just one note, we'll end here and then just tell people where they can find you. But something I've noticed for myself in learning more about history is that, like, we, provided we don't kill ourselves or AI doesn't kill us, there's going to come a time where future generations are going to look back on our time the way we look back on other times, as being these crazy pivotal moments where there really is only a fraction of, where there's going to be more because of the, podcasts and YouTube videos that are like so much more information to go forward into the future now. But the narrative's going to be that like this crazy shit happened. And even in the craziest times of world wars and all sorts of stuff, there was this weird normality of life that kind of goes along with it. And that's sort of like the beauty of just being grateful for having it, you know.
Yeah.
And for the small moments, because what we're dealing with ultimately is no different in some really like fundamental ways as anything any human has ever gone through.
Exactly, for sure.
All right.
Definitely.
I know you got to go. Where
Perfect.
can people find you? Thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah, dude. No, this was great. I had
today.
a good. No, this was a good chat. I really enjoyed our time going over things. You can find me at Liam Out Loud anywhere. Instagram. There's a couple like it's liam.out.loud. Yeah, Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, YouTube. You can find it.
Cool, man. Well, I'll put it all in the show notes, and great chatting with you, and keep up the great work. Okay.
Thank you, brother. Yeah, we'll talk soon.
Okay. Bye.
There's no such thing as solutions. There's only trade-offs.
Yeah. The record button here.
Perfect.
All right. So we don't have to jump like immediately into it, but thanks for joining me, man.
Yeah, no, dude, I'm stoked to get chatting to you today here. You know what? Let me grab that towel off the back of my door. That looks a little janky.
Yeah, I don't have a good background. Actually, you can't hear me right now, eh?
I guess it doesn't hurt to have people know the hygiene is in check, but
no, you're looking good, looking fresh and groomed. Yeah, I'm just doing audio right now anyway. We can keep our video on for the call, but I haven't been. I actually tried to do video for one of my last ones that I released, but my computer's like so old that iMovie like just gives a fucking error if I try to export anything.
Shit, really?
And I haven't been able to fix it, so it'll be audio only. But
yeah, it's no fun. Man. Computer issues aren't fun to deal with.
Yeah.
Hello there. How you doing?